I should have walked away, but she whispered, and I stayed. Evan Rourke had walked through this sector more times than he could count, and each time it had been the same. Quiet enough to hear the hum of the coolant pumps behind the bulkheads, damp enough that the air tasted faintly metallic, and empty enough that he could convince himself no one actually lived here anymore. Rustwater Station's Lower Loop 7 had been designed for miners back when the ore contracts were steady. The hydroponics bays were still green, and the station's central climate systems kept every corridor at a predictable 22 degrees with recycled air that didn't carry the smell of decay. That was before the freezebacks, before the oxygen ration disputes, before 3 sectors were simply abandoned to save on maintenance. He was here because the Environmental Regulation Division still had to file monthly reports, and his job, quiet, unnoticed, essential only on paper, was to walk the forgotten blocks, log corrosion data, test air composition, check vent pressure, and then go home. He liked it that way. No team, no supervisor breathing down his neck, no need to explain himself to anyone. His boots made a soft thud against the warped flooring panels as he turned a corner into one of the narrower service corridors, the kind where the lighting strips had dimmed to a sickly yellow over the years. He glanced at the data slate in his left hand, thumb tapping through the environmental readings. Oxygen levels at 74%. Not ideal, but stable. Moisture index high, which meant the insulation in the overhead ducts was still shot. Pressure fluctuations in the vent network were minor, not enough to trigger an emergency repair ticket. He typed a brief note for the station database and kept moving, ignoring the drip of condensation from a pipe elbow above his head. He told himself not to look around too much, because he already knew what he'd see. Discarded ration packs, warped doors that would never open again, and the faint watermark stains that climbed up the walls from years of leaks no one had bothered to fix. But then something shifted at the edge of his vision. Not the flicker of bad lighting, not the slow sway of a loose cable. Something deliberate, if small. He stopped. The movement had come from near an exhaust vent in the wall ahead, one of the older models with a rusted grate and a low, constant hiss of warm air. He stepped forward slowly, the sound of his boots suddenly louder in the silence. It took another few meters before he saw her. She was sitting with her back wedged into the corner where the vent met the bulkhead, knees drawn tight to her chest, head lowered so her hair, a pale color under the dirt and grease, fell forward like a curtain. Her clothing, if it still counted, was a shredded thermal poncho, frayed at the edges, slipping from one shoulder to expose a collarbone sharp enough to draw lines under her skin. Bare legs extended to the floor, feet flat against the damp plating. She didn't look up as he approached, didn't flinch, didn't even shift her weight. It hit him then, the smell. It was thick, immediate, not just the sour edge of unwashed fabric, but something heavier, chemical, like synthetic pheromones gone wrong, clinging to every breath. It wasn't the kind of odor you could step back from and escape. It wrapped around you, burrowed in. He had heard the stories before, in the unkind shorthand people used. The woman by the vent, the smell girl, the one you couldn't get near without gagging. They said she was part alien, that an industrial accident had ruined her body chemistry, made her unfit for indoor housing, for work, for even standing in line with others. He had passed her once before, weeks ago, without stopping. That was what you did here. You kept walking. But now he stood still, the data slate idle in his hand, watching the way she didn't move, didn't ask for help, didn't try to make herself seem less alone. She was simply there, as much a fixture as the vent itself. Evan clenched his jaw. His training had not prepared him for this. He wasn't a medic, wasn't a counselor, wasn't a rescuer. His job was duct pressure and moisture seals. And yet the thought of leaving her here, of pretending again that she wasn't real, landed in his chest like a weight. He took a slow step forward. She looked up. Her face was sharper than he expected beneath the grime. High cheekbones traced faintly with a silver marbling pattern that might have been natural or might have been the result of whatever chemical had changed her. Her skin, under the dirt, was a pale violet shade, the color subtle but distinct even in the bad lighting. Her eyes locked on him, wide and flat, like she was waiting for the insult before it landed. "I can offer you a place to wash," he heard himself say. His voice was quieter than he meant, like any louder might break something. She didn't answer. He didn't move. They stayed like that until, finally, she unfolded her legs and rose to her feet, slow and deliberate. No words, no gratitude, just a decision. He turned and she followed. They climbed the stairwell to his quarters in silence. The stairwell sealant had long since cracked, and the faint drizzle from the outer hull bled through, dampening the edges of the steps. At his door, he keyed in the access code. The panel hissed open to reveal a narrow single-room unit. Functional, nothing more. A cot along one wall, a heater vent beside it, a small food prep counter, a folding chair, and a fresher unit down the short hall. The air inside smelled faintly of clean metal and soap, the way he liked it. He gestured toward the fresher. "You can use the water. There's a towel on the rail." She stepped past him without comment, closing the fresher door behind her. Evan sat on the edge of the cot, pressing his palms to his knees. His chest was tight, not from the smell. He could still faintly catch it, but from the not knowing who she was beyond the rumors. Whether she'd vanish the moment she was clean. The sound of water running filled the silence. He didn't move until 15 minutes later, when the fresher door opened again. She stood barefoot, hair damp and darker now, wearing the oversized gray shirt he had left on the counter. It hung to mid-thigh on her, the sleeves loose around her wrists. Her skin looked softer now, the pale violet clearer, the silver marbling almost luminous in the fresher light. She clutched the towel in both hands, not like she feared losing it, but like she wasn't sure where to put it down. Evan cleared his throat, stepped to the counter, and retrieved a sealed ration pack. He snapped the heating tab, set it down. "It's hot," he said. She crossed to the heater vent instead, settling on the floor with the ration tray in her lap. She ate slowly, mechanically, and when she finished, she pulled the blanket from the cot and sat against the wall. Not under it, just near it, as if ready to move the moment he told her to. Hours passed. He tried to focus on his corrosion report, but his eyes kept flicking toward her. She didn't fidget, didn't speak, didn't fall asleep. When she finally broke the silence, her voice was quiet. "Do I still smell bad?" He looked over, met her half-closed eyes. "No," he said. "You smell like steam." She exhaled, not relief, not joy, just a breath, and closed her eyes for real this time. The rain outside shifted from a light patter to a slow, steady drum. The heater hummed, and Evan realized he hadn't asked her name. Not yet, but tonight she was dry, warm, and still here. And that, for reasons he didn't fully understand yet, felt like enough. Evan stayed in the chair longer than he needed to, hands folded loosely in his lap, the corrosion report open on his slate, but ignored. He could still hear the soft shift of fabric as she adjusted slightly against the wall, and he realized that for someone who had probably spent months on hard metal and damp concrete, even a thin blanket and a warm vent might feel like more than she expected. The thought stayed with him, not because it was profound, but because it made the room feel different. He set the slate aside and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. The smell in the room had changed. Earlier, there had been the sharp chemical edge, now replaced by clean water and faint synthetic soap. The change wasn't just in the air, it was in how the space felt less like a place he had been guarding from intrusion, and more like a place someone else could inhabit without disrupting it. He told himself he'd decide in the morning whether she could stay another day, but the truth was he already knew he wouldn't send her away. Sometime during the night, he dozed in the chair, head tilted back, only to wake with a stiff neck and the faint awareness of movement in the room. She was standing now, blanket in her hands, folding it with slow precision. He didn't speak, just watched as she set it neatly at the end of the cot and then sat back down on the floor. It wasn't the behavior of someone planning to take advantage. It was the behavior of someone used to being told to leave and wanting to leave things better than she found them. Morning on Rustwater Station didn't arrive with sunlight. There was no sun to see, but the environmental lamps in the corridors shifted to a cooler spectrum to simulate day. Evan woke to the low buzz of the heater and the sound of water dripping steadily into a small metal bowl she had set under a leak in the far corner. She noticed he was awake and straightened slightly, but didn't speak. "I didn't get your name," he said finally. She paused as if considering whether it was worth giving, then said, "Selai." "Evan," he replied. No handshake, no comment. Just the exchange, plain and unadorned. He moved to the counter, activated the heating plate, and set another ration pack on top. As it warmed, he glanced over his shoulder. She was still seated by the vent, knees pulled close, her eyes on the floor. He couldn't tell if it was shyness, distrust, or simply habit. "There's food if you want it," he said. She stood, crossed the small room, and took the pack without touching his hand. She sat at the low table, technically just a folding crate he had been using since his second week on the station, and ate in small, measured bites. The only sounds were the faint clink of utensil against plastic and the constant hiss of the heater. When she finished, she set the empty pack back on the counter without a word, then returned to the wall. Evan tried to read her body language, but it was like reading a sealed door. There was nothing to see unless she opened it herself. He checked the time on his slate. He was due to inspect Sector D14 within the hour. He didn't want to leave her alone, but the job wasn't something he could ignore. "I'll be gone for a couple of hours," he said. "You can stay here if you want. The door locks automatically." She looked at him then, not with suspicion, but with a kind of alertness that suggested she was measuring what that offer meant. "I'll stay," she said simply. Evan nodded once and began gathering his gear. He didn't ask why. The walk to D14 was uneventful. Just more damp corridors, more corroded ducts, more data points no one would act on. But his mind kept circling back to the small gray shirt, the folded blanket, the way she had said, "I'll stay," as if it was not just a choice for the morning, but a temporary acceptance of something bigger. When he returned 2 hours later, the first thing he noticed was that the place smelled different again. Not just clean, but lived in. The second thing he noticed was that the crate table had been wiped down. The damp bowl under the leak was half full, but no longer splashing because she'd shifted it slightly. And the ration wrappers that had been on the counter were gone. Selai was sitting cross-legged near the heater, hair brushed back now, the silver marbling on her temples catching the light. She looked up when he entered but didn't speak. "You didn't have to do that," he said, nodding toward the clean space. "I know," she replied. Her voice was level, almost neutral, but it carried a weight that said she wasn't doing it for approval. He set his toolkit down, leaning against the wall. "You're not from here," he guessed. "No," she said. "Me neither," he offered. "I got posted here last cycle. Volunteered." Her eyebrows shifted slightly. "Why?" "Because this place doesn't expect much from you," he said. "I like things quiet." That earned the faintest nod, like she understood. They stayed in that quiet for a long moment, the kind of silence that wasn't hostile, but wasn't exactly comfortable yet either. Then she said, "They told me I'd never smell clean again." Evan didn't know what to say, so he waited. "Pheromone imbalance," she added. "I worked hydrothermal maintenance in the core sector. Chemical spill. Damaged my skin chemistry." She looked toward the heater. "No one wanted me near them after that." Her tone wasn't bitter, just tired. Evan shifted his weight. "You seem fine to me now." She gave a small, almost invisible shrug. "It doesn't last. Heat, stress, it comes back." "Then we take it a day at a time," he said. She didn't respond, but her eyes flicked toward him for half a second before she looked away. That night, she didn't stay by the wall. She took the blanket and sat on the edge of the cot, then lay down without asking. Evan didn't question it. He moved to the floor, pulling his jacket over himself. He heard her shift once, then stillness. Hours later, he felt the weight of the blanket slide off the cot and settle over him. By morning, the blanket was still there, warm from her side of the bed. Evan didn't pretend to be asleep when she rose. She moved quietly, refolding the blanket before returning it to the cot. He sat up, watching her braid her hair loosely over one shoulder. Her fingers were quick, practiced, as though they'd done this 1,000 times in better places. He made them both tea from the last sachet he had. She accepted the cup without a word and sat at the low table. "You can stay another night," he said. This time she didn't look surprised. "All right." It wasn't gratitude exactly, but it was acceptance. He knew then that this wasn't going to be a single act of kindness or a temporary arrangement. This was the start of something that would take days, weeks, maybe months to understand. And for reasons he couldn't explain, not to her, not to himself, he was willing to see it through. The station groaned softly around them, the sound of distant machinery carrying through the bulkheads like the pulse of some slow, patient animal. Outside, the corridors would still be damp, the vents still leaking, the air still tasting faintly of rust. But inside this small room for now there was warmth and the faint, clean scent of steam. And she was still here. The sound of Rustwater Station waking was never sudden. It was a gradual layering of noise, the low whir of the main circulation pumps shifting to a higher pitch as the cycle switched from night chill to simulated day warmth, the faint rumble of cargo lifters on the upper deck starting their runs, the occasional metallic groan from pressure changes in the outer hull. Evan was already awake when the environmental lights in the corridor outside shifted from the muted orange of night mode to the pale bluish hue of day. Sci-Fi was sitting at the crate table, the chipped ceramic cup he had given her cradled between her palms. She hadn't touched the tea yet. She was watching the heater vent like it might change if she stared long enough. "You're up early," he said quietly, rubbing at his eyes. "I don't sleep much," she replied, not looking at him. He moved to the counter, checking the rations. He'd have to pick up more today if he could find a vendor still taking station credits. He wasn't sure what she'd been eating before she came here, if she'd been eating at all, but he figured it hadn't been regular. He set a packet on the heating plate, activated it, and leaned against the counter. When the steam started to rise from the vent in the ration pack, she finally looked up at him. It wasn't a sharp look, more like she was trying to read the purpose behind his movements. "You can take the bed again tonight," he said, matter of fact. She frowned slightly. "And you?" "The floor's fine," he said. Her gaze lingered on him for another beat before she returned it to the cup in her hands. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. He could see the acknowledgement in the fact that she didn't refuse. They ate in silence. He noticed she still measured each bite, like she was rationing not just the food, but the act of eating itself. When she finished, she set the empty tray precisely at the corner of the counter, aligned with the edge, as if order in small things was a shield against disorder everywhere else. "I'll be out most of the day," he said. "Sector D12, some vent pressure issues." "I can go," she said suddenly. Evan blinked. "With me?" Her eyes flicked to his, then away. "If it's work." "I used to work." He thought about that. He'd been prepared to tell her she could stay here, keep warm, maybe rest. But there was something in her voice, not eagerness, but a quiet insistence that this wasn't charity. "All right," he said finally. "We leave in 20. The walk to Sector D12 took them through two connector corridors and a freight passage that still smelled faintly of coolant leaks from a spill months ago. Evan kept his pace steady, not too fast, aware she hadn't been through these parts in a long time. At first her posture was closed, shoulders slightly forward, eyes down. He recognized the defensive curve of someone who'd learned to avoid eye contact before it became an excuse for trouble. But after a few turns, when they passed a pair of cargo techs who didn't even glance at her stance changed. Just a little. She straightened by a fraction, her gaze lifting enough to scan the corridor ahead. They reached the maintenance hatch for the main vent line. Evan knelt, unlocking the panel with his toolkit. "Pressure's been low here for 2 cycles, he explained without looking up. "Probably a gasket seal." Sci-Fi crouched beside him, eyes scanning the jumble of pipes and conduits. "Not that one," she said after a moment, pointing to the right. "The blue flex joint. That's where the leak will be." He gave her a sidelong glance. "How do you know?" "They use the same joints in the hydrothermal core," she said. "Same failure pattern." He checked the joint she'd indicated. Sure enough, moisture beaded along the seam. He tightened it with the small adjustable spanner, then rechecked the readout. Pressure stabilized. "You were right," he said simply. She didn't smile, but there was a faint shift in her expression, something like the memory of being useful. They moved through the rest of the inspection route in the same quiet efficiency. Evan would scan, log readings, adjust a setting. Sci-Fi would watch, occasionally offer a short observation that turned out to save him time. She didn't try to prove herself. She just worked. By the time they returned to his unit, the heater's steady hum felt different. Not just background noise, but something that marked the space as safe again. Sci-Fi hung her jacket on the peg by the door without being told. He noticed the small streaks of dust on her hands and offered a damp cloth. She took it, wiped her palms clean, and set it neatly on the counter. "You can go again tomorrow," he said. She paused halfway to the heater vent. "If you want me to," she said. "I do," he replied. That evening, as the environmental lamps dimmed toward night mode, Evan found himself watching her again, not in the way of someone studying a problem, but like someone noticing details for the first time. The way she brushed her hair back behind one ear when it fell forward, the way she sat close to the heater, but never too close, as if she'd learned to balance comfort with caution. She caught him looking once. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "Just didn't expect you to still be here." Her gaze didn't waver. "No one asked my name before today," she said. It was such a simple sentence, but it landed in his chest like a weight. He realized then that she'd given it to him deliberately this morning, and that maybe it had been more than just an introduction. Maybe it was permission. They sat in silence for a while after that, the kind of silence that wasn't empty, the kind that meant there would be more to say, eventually, when the space between them was ready for it. And for the first time since she'd stepped out of the vent corner into his world, Evan felt certain she wasn't going to vanish overnight. The hours slid by in that way they sometimes did on Rustwater Station, without much to mark their passing except for the temperature shift in the air and the hum of the main circulation fans changing pitch. Evan sat at the crate table with his data slate, trying to log the inspection results from earlier, but finding his attention drifting to the soft, steady rhythm of Salai's breathing across the room. She was stretched out on the cot, not sleeping, but lying still, eyes half open as though she were watching something in her mind rather than in the room. It occurred to him that this was probably the first time in months, maybe longer, that she'd had a door between herself and the rest of the station, a space where she didn't have to brace for someone to pass too close, wrinkle their nose, or mutter under their breath. He wondered if that was why she stayed so still, as if afraid movement might break whatever fragile balance she'd found here. When he finally set the slate down, she glanced at him. "You didn't go out tonight." "Didn't need to," he said. "Most of my work is daytime." "Easier to see the leaks?" He nodded. "Easier to avoid the fights over heat allocation, too." She didn't respond to that, but her gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than it had before. Then she turned her head toward the heater again, as if drawing whatever comfort she could from its low, even breath. The next morning she was already up when he stirred, standing by the counter with one of his ration packs in her hands. She turned it over, studying the printed heating instructions. "You want breakfast?" he asked, voice still rough with sleep. "I can make it," she said, and set the pack on the heating plate without waiting for his answer. He sat up, watching as she moved with deliberate precision, as though each small action was a test she intended to pass. She poured water into the cup, waited for the steam, then set the heated tray on the table and slid it toward him. "What about you?" he asked. She gestured toward the second pack she'd already started heating. He nodded, accepting the arrangement without fuss. They ate in silence again, but it was a different silence now. Less like two strangers occupying the same space, more like two people who had learned not to waste words on things that didn't need them. When they left for the day's inspections, Salai walked half a step behind him at first, eyes scanning the corridor. The early hour meant the station's lower levels were quieter, but they still passed a few maintenance workers hauling tool crates or water tanks. No one said anything to her. One man glanced up as they passed, looked from Evan to Salai, then went back to his work without comment. Evan saw her shoulders ease fractionally after that. They reached a main junction where the venting system for 3 sectors converged. Evan pulled the access panel open, the scent of damp insulation wafting out. "Moisture's high here," he muttered. Salai crouched beside him, tracing one of the smaller pipes with her finger. "This junction's been patched before," she said. He followed her gaze and saw the thin line of sealant already cracking. "Good eye," he said, and began scraping the old sealant away so he could reapply. She held the light steady for him without being asked, her free hand braced against the wall for balance. They moved like that through the day, him handling the official scans and logs, her anticipating where he'd need a tool or pointing out a problem before he found it. It wasn't conversation-heavy work, but it didn't need to be. The rhythm was enough. By the time they returned to his quarters, his shoulders ached pleasantly from the labor, and there was a faint smudge of sealant on her cheek. She didn't seem to notice, and he didn't point it out. She went straight to the counter, retrieved a cloth, and began wiping down the tools before putting them back in the crate. "You don't have to clean my gear," he said. "I know," she replied, same as before, and kept going. He let her. That night, as they settled into their respective places, the cot for her, the floor for him, he caught her watching him. "What?" he asked, half smiling. She hesitated, then said, "Most people look at me like I'm trouble." "You haven't been," he said. "Not yet," she murmured, almost to herself. He leaned back against the wall. "I'm not waiting for you to be." Her eyes searched his for a moment, then she turned onto her side, facing the heater. The conversation, like so many between them, ended not with a conclusion, but with a space left open for later. Over the next several days, the pattern held. They worked together during the day, she helped with small tasks in the unit in the evening, and the silence between them softened into something companionable. She still didn't talk about herself much, but now and then she'd let slip a fragment. How the hydrothermal maintenance crews had timed their breaks by the shift in the vent output, or how the smell of certain coolants reminded her of the ice harvesters docking at the upper bays. Evan didn't press for more. He figured the rest would come when she decided it mattered. One evening, after a long day sealing vent leaks in Sector E3, they sat at the table with 2 steaming cups of tea. The heater hummed, the corridor outside was quiet, and the faint scent of the herbs from the tea sachet curled through the air. "You know," she said suddenly, "no one asked my name for months. People would just refer to me, the smell girl, the vent woman, like I couldn't hear them." Evan looked at her over the rim of his cup. "And you gave me yours the first morning." She nodded once. "Because you didn't ask why I was there. You didn't make it a condition." He set his cup down slowly. "I figured you'd tell me if you wanted to." Her gaze held his for a moment, steady and unflinching, before she looked away again. "That's why I did." Later, as he lay on the floor listening to the faint sound of her breathing on the cot, Evan thought about how small that moment had seemed at the time. Just 2 names exchanged in the morning light. But now he understood it for what it was. The first thread in something she might be willing to weave, if she decided he was worth the effort. He didn't know where that would lead. But as the station's night cycle settled in, and the heater's steady warmth filled the room, he knew one thing with surprising certainty. She wasn't just passing through. Morning on Rustwater Station was less about sunrise and more about the shift in sound. The deep, slow hum of night cycle ventilation rose half a tone as the central systems adjusted for day cycle airflow. Water pumps kicked in somewhere below their deck, sending a faint shiver through the floor plates. Evan was at the crate table with his tea when Selai emerged from the fresher, hair damp, sleeves pushed to her elbows. She didn't move toward the heater like she usually did. Instead, she crossed to the counter and opened the storage drawer where he kept the ration packs. "You're running low," she said, glancing at the meager stack inside. "I know," he replied. "I'll pick up more after work." "I'll go," she said simply. He paused with his cup halfway to his mouth. "You don't have to." "I want to," she interrupted, not sharply, but with a quiet finality. He set the cup down. "All right, after the inspection run." The day's route took them through Sector C9, one of the few mid-level sectors still operating at half capacity. The corridors here weren't as corroded, but the lighting flickered now and then, and the air carried the tang of metal filings from the nearby repair bays. Selai walked beside him, not trailing behind. Her hood was down, silver marbling at her temples catching the overhead light. At first, she kept her eyes on the floor, but when no one stopped or stepped away from her, she began to lift her gaze. They passed a group of dock hands moving crates onto a grav cart. One of them looked up briefly, eyes flicking from Evan to Selai. He didn't wrinkle his nose. He didn't say a word. He just went back to securing the straps. Evan caught the almost imperceptible loosening of her shoulders. She didn't mention it, but he noticed. At the first vent inspection point, Evan knelt with his scanner while Selai examined the joint seams. "This one's going to fail soon," she said, tapping a small hairline crack in the gasket. He scanned it and confirmed the pressure fluctuation. "Good catch." She didn't smile, but she stayed closer after that, leaning over his shoulder when he pulled up the readings, asking short, precise questions about the data. By the third checkpoint, she was working the sealing compound herself, gloves snug over her hands as she smoothed the adhesive along a damp seam. "You've done this before," he remarked. "Different systems, same problems," she said. When the route was complete, They doubled back toward the market strip on deck 5. The air there was thicker, carrying a mix of fried food oil, coolant vapor, and the faint spice of imported tea leaves. Vendors called out prices over the low hum of passers-by, their stalls lit with patched neon signs. Salai kept her hood down. She walked straight to a ration vendor, selected a stack of packs, and set them on the counter. The vendor, a wiry man with grease under his fingernails, rang up the total without so much as a second glance at her. Evan watched her fingers tighten slightly around the strap of the bag as they walked away. "No one moved back," she said quietly. "No reason they should," he replied. "They used to," she murmured. He glanced at her, but she didn't elaborate. Back at his quarters, Salai set the rations in the drawer, aligning them in neat rows. Then she turned to him. "Tomorrow," she said, "we should check the intake filters in D7. The air felt heavy there today." He studied her for a moment. "You noticed that walking through?" "Yes," she said, as if it were obvious. He nodded. "Then we'll check it." That night, the heater's hum filled the small room. Salai sat cross-legged on the cot, combing her hair with slow, careful strokes. Evan was at the table, scanning through his day's reports, but his eyes kept drifting back to her. "What?" she asked without looking up. "You're different today," he said. She paused the comb for a second, then resumed. "I was outside, and no one ran." He let the silence hold for a moment before he said, "That's worth keeping." She set the comb down and met his eyes. "Maybe." The next morning, she was the one who suggested leaving earlier. Their route took them into D7, as she'd mentioned, where the air did feel heavier. She located the intake panel without hesitation, unlatching it to reveal a filter caked with gray dust. "No wonder," she said, pulling it free. Evan replaced it with one from his kit, making a mental note to log the change with maintenance records. "You see things fast," he told her. "I had to," she said. "In the Corps, if you missed something, people got hurt." He understood the weight behind that and didn't press further. By the end of that week, their rhythm had changed again. She no longer waited for him to invite her on the runs. She prepared her own gloves in the morning, checked his kit for missing tools, and even reminded him when he left a scanner on standby. One evening, after a long inspection loop, they returned to find the heater vent sputtering. Salai knelt beside it immediately, pried off the cover, and adjusted the alignment plate until the airflow evened out. She replaced the cover, stood, and wiped her hands on a cloth without a word. Evan watched her for a long moment. "You could probably run my job without me," he said. She gave the faintest smirk. "Probably." It was the first hint of humor he'd heard from her, and he found himself smiling back. They were sitting at the table later, tea cooling in their cups, when she spoke again. "I used to be good at what I did," she said. "People knew it." "They'll know it again," he said. She shook her head. "Not like before, but maybe enough." "Enough for what?" She looked at him for a moment, then down at her tea. "Enough to feel like I belong somewhere again." Evan didn't answer right away. He thought of her standing in the market, hood down, buying rations without a single person recoiling. "One breath at a time," he said finally. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. By the time the station's night cycle began, Evan knew this wasn't just about her getting used to the world again. It was about the world adjusting to her presence, quietly, without ceremony, but undeniably. And for the first time, he let himself believe that maybe she wouldn't just survive here. Maybe she would live. The heater had been temperamental all week, coughing out occasional bursts of lukewarm air instead of the steady stream that kept the room comfortable. Evan had meant to take it apart on the weekend, but the inspection logs had piled up, and Salai had been different lately. Not distant, if anything, more present, but in a way that made the air between them feel charged, even when neither of them spoke. That night, the station's night cycle had just begun. The corridor outside was quiet except for the faint creak of the hull as temperature gradients shifted through the decks. Inside, Salai sat on the cot, feet bare, one knee drawn up, running a cloth slowly along the length of her gloves. Evan was at the crate table with his data slate, but his eyes kept drifting toward her. "You're staring again," she said without looking up. He set the slate down. "I was thinking." "About?" He hesitated. "About how this place feels different with you in it." Her hands stilled for just a moment before she set the gloves aside. "Different how?" "Less temporary." She looked at him then, searching his face like she was trying to catch a trick of the light. I haven't decided if I'm staying, she said, though her tone didn't carry the bite it might have a few weeks ago. I know, he said, but you're here now. That's enough for me. The space between them stayed still after that. Not empty, but not yet crossed. The next morning, their inspection route took them through one of the quieter maintenance corridors in Sector B4. It was narrow enough that they had to walk single file, and when Evans stopped to check a pressure reading, she stepped close behind him to hold the light. Close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating through the sleeve of her jacket. Close enough that her breathing was a steady counterpoint to the hum of the machinery around them. When he straightened, he caught her looking at him, but she didn't step back. Pressure's fine, he said, more to break the tension than because she needed the information. She gave a single nod and moved ahead of him without another word. Later that day, back in his quarters, Evan was kneeling in front of the heater with the cover off, tightening a mounting bracket. Sci-Fi sat nearby on the floor, leaning against the wall with her legs stretched out, watching him work. You fix a lot of things, she said after a while. It's my job. That's not what I mean, she said, and he looked up to find her eyes on him, steady. You fix things that aren't in your job description. He considered that. Not everything has to be on a checklist to matter. Something in her gaze shifted. Not softened exactly, but steadied. That's why I'm still here, she said. The space between them was smaller after that. That evening, when they settled into their usual spots, her on the cot, him on the floor, the heater hummed a little stronger, the repairs holding for now. Evan was pulling the blanket over himself when her voice stopped him. You can sit here, she said, patting the space beside her. He looked at her for a moment, weighing the invitation. Then he crossed the short distance and sat on the edge of the cot. They didn't touch. They didn't speak. But the air between them was no longer something to be navigated. It was something to be shared. Over the next few days, that space became a familiar place. Sometimes it was sitting side by side on the cot after dinner, not talking, each of them focused on their own small task. Sometimes it was standing a little closer at a maintenance panel so they could both see the readout. Once it was her handing him a tool without him asking, their fingers brushing for a moment longer than necessary. None of it was planned. None of it was explained. But it was happening one breath at a time. One evening, the station's overhead systems had a partial power drop in their sector, dimming the lights and lowering the ambient temperature. Evan checked the comm panel. No emergency notice, just a scheduled load shift. But the quarters felt colder almost immediately. Sci-Fi was sitting near the heater, rubbing her hands together. Without thinking too much about it, Evan pulled the blanket from the cot and draped it over her shoulders. She looked up at him, eyes unreadable in the low light. You'll get cold, she said. I've been colder, he replied, settling onto the floor nearby. She hesitated, then shifted, letting the blanket fall across both of them. He didn't move closer, but she did, just enough that their shoulders touched. They stayed like that until the lights brightened again and the temperature began to climb. It was a small thing, the kind of thing no one else would notice or care about. But in Rustwater Station, in this room, it meant everything. The space between them wasn't empty anymore. It was warm. It was alive. And neither of them seemed in any hurry to let it go. The next morning started earlier than either of them preferred. A static-laced comm alert chimed through the wall speaker at 600, ordering all maintenance personnel to report to their designated sectors for an unscheduled inspection sweep. Evan groaned quietly as he pulled on his work jacket, but Sci-Fi was already on her feet, slipping into her boots. You don't have to come, he said, fastening the jacket's collar. I know, she said, lacing her second boot without looking at him. I want to. There was no pause in her voice, no hesitation. It was an answer that, weeks ago, she might have kept to herself or let him assume, but now she gave it freely. The inspection route took them through a sector Evan disliked, D3 near the auxiliary power couplings. It was narrow, crowded with bundled conduits, and loud with the thrum of machinery running at half balance. Most people kept their heads down here. The air smelled faintly of hot metal and singed insulation. Sci-Fi stayed close, partly to be heard over the noise, partly because the space was tight enough that moving single file was inevitable. At one point, he needed to reach a panel above head height, and she stepped forward without being asked, bracing the base of the inspection ladder while he climbed. Her hands on the ladder frame were steady, the muscles in her arms taut with the strain of holding it in place. When he descended, their eyes met briefly. His hands still on the rung, hers still on the frame. Neither of them stepped back immediately. By midday, they were in a quieter stretch, inspecting vent lines above an unused storage bay. Sci-Fi crouched beside him as he ran the pressure scan, her knee brushing lightly against his. She didn't move away, and neither did he. "You've done this route before?" she asked, watching the readout. "A few times," he said, "usually alone." She made a small sound in her throat, something between thought and acknowledgement. "Better with two." He glanced at her, but her focus was still on the display. "Yeah," he said, "it is." When they returned to his quarters, the air inside felt warmer than usual, though the heater vent hummed at its normal pace. Sci-Fi moved to the counter and began unloading the tools from his kit without a word, wiping each one clean and setting it in a neat row on the crate table. Evan hung his jacket and watched her for a moment, then stepped forward to help. Their hands bumped once over the same wrench. She didn't pull back immediately, and the brief pressure of skin against skin lingered before they each took an end of the tool to put it away. The air between them felt heavier after that, not uncomfortable, but thick with something neither of them named. That night, the station lights dimmed into night cycle, and the heater's quiet hum filled the small room. Sci-Fi sat on the cot, combing her hair in long, deliberate strokes. Evan was at the table trying to read the repair logs, but his eyes kept drifting to the way her hair caught the low light. "You're doing it again," she said without looking at him. "Doing what?" "Looking like you're trying to figure something out." "Maybe I am," he said. She paused in her combing. "And?" He closed the slate and set it down. "And I think the space between us is getting smaller." She looked at him then, really looked, and after a long moment, she set the comb aside and patted the empty space beside her. He crossed the distance in 3 steps and sat down. They didn't touch, but the warmth radiating from her was immediate. The space wasn't gone, not yet, but it was no longer something to be crossed with caution. Over the next few days, the changes were subtle but constant. She began handing him tools before he asked. He started leaving the blanket draped over the cot instead of folded at the end, and she would wordlessly shift it so there was room for both of them to sit. When they walked through the market strip, she didn't keep her hood up anymore. One evening, on their way back from a long inspection loop, they were caught in a brief station-wide power drop. The corridor lights dimmed to emergency levels, and the temperature dipped fast. Evan was about to offer her his jacket when she stepped closer, their shoulders touching in the dark. "It's fine," she murmured, as if answering a question he hadn't voiced. And somehow it was. The first time she reached for him without purpose was on a night when neither of them could sleep. He was lying on the floor staring at the ceiling when he felt the faint brush of her fingers against his forearm. Not a grip, not even a request, just contact. He turned his head toward her. "You awake?" he asked quietly. "Yeah," she said. Her hand stayed where it was, and after a moment, he shifted so they were sitting side by side against the wall, the heater vent warm at their feet. They didn't speak for a long time. By the end of the week, the space between them had become something else entirely. It wasn't a barrier anymore. It was a choice, a place they could close at will. That night, as the rain pattered faintly against the outer hull, they sat on the cot together, the blanket draped loosely across both their shoulders. Sci-Fi leaned back slightly, her head close enough to his that he could feel the movement of her breath. "You've been different lately," he said softly. "So have you," she replied. He turned his head just enough to meet her gaze. "In a good way?" She didn't answer right away. Then, "In a way that makes the space feel safe." He let out a slow breath, not breaking eye contact. "Then I'll keep it that way." And for the rest of the night, they stayed there, shoulder to shoulder, neither of them moving away. The next morning began like any other. The low hum of the heater, the slow shift in air tone as rust-water systems rolled into day cycle, the faint scent of reheated tea lingering from the night before. Evan sat at the crate table, leaning over the small map display on his slate, planning their inspection route. Sci-Fi was still on the cot, knees drawn up beneath the blanket, hair loose over her shoulders. "You're staring again," she said without looking at him. He smiled faintly. "Maybe. Maybe what?" "Maybe I just like seeing you here in the morning." That drew her eyes up. She didn't look away this time. I'm getting used to it too, she said. They left earlier than usual, taking a detour through the lower hydro bays. The humidity there wrapped around them like a warm blanket, the air heavy with the scent of algae filters and nutrient solution. Salai lingered a little at one of the observation ports, looking out over the rows of shallow tanks lit with pale blue grow lamps. Haven't been down here in a long time, she said. You worked in something like this, right? Similar, she said, her gaze distant. Cleaner than this, though. When they moved on, she walked closer than she usually did, her arm brushing his more than once in the narrow passages. By midday, they were in an empty connector corridor between sectors, the hum of machinery faint through the bulkheads. Evan stopped to check a pressure gauge, and Salai stepped beside him, their shoulders touching as she leaned in to read the dial. Normal? She asked. Normal, he confirmed, but neither of them moved back. The touch wasn't accidental this time. Back in his quarters that evening, they ate in quiet comfort, the heater running strong. Salai had taken to sitting on the floor by the vent, blanket draped over her legs. Evan sat nearby, the warmth spilling over both of them. It's warmer here than on the cot, she said. You could move it closer, he suggested. Or you could sit closer, she countered, her voice light but steady. He shifted until their knees touched. The blanket slipped between them, but the heat from her body was more noticeable than the heater's steady breath. The days that followed settled into an unspoken agreement. Closeness was no longer something to be avoided. When they worked, they stood shoulder to shoulder at panels. When they ate, they sat so their legs touched beneath the crate table. When they rested, they shared the blanket without fuss. It wasn't until the fifth night that she shifted from sitting beside him to leaning against him. They were on the cot, heater casting a faint orange glow across the room. She let her head rest on his shoulder, her hair falling forward over his chest. You're warm, she murmured. So are you, he replied quietly. He could feel the rhythm of her breathing against his side, steady but deeper than usual. The weight of her was light but deliberate, not something that could be mistaken for a tired slump. You can put your arm around me, she said after a moment. He did slowly, careful not to make it a cage, just a steady line of contact across her back. Her eyes closed. Better, she whispered. From then on, it was normal to find themselves in some kind of touch. A hand on his forearm when she passed him a tool, her knee pressed to his when they sat, his palm resting briefly against her back when they walked through crowded corridors. None of it was hurried. None of it was forced. The heater had once been the warmest point in the room. Now it wasn't even close. One evening, rain pattered softly against the outer hull, a sound that always made the quarters feel more isolated. Evan was reading from his slate when Salai crossed the room, blanket in hand, and without a word draped it over both of them. She settled beside him, her thigh against his, shoulder tucked beneath his. You ever think about before? She asked. Before what? Before this, she said, gesturing lightly between them. He thought about it. Not as much as I think about now. She gave a small, almost hidden smile. Good. That night, they stayed like that until the heater cycled down for the night. The space between them was gone entirely. The following morning, the quarters still smelled faintly of tea, warm fabric, and the mineral tang of rain hitting the outer plating. Evan woke to find Salai already sitting on the edge of the cot, elbows on her knees, staring quietly at the floor. She had the blanket draped loosely over her shoulders, her hair a soft tangle down her back. You're up early, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. I didn't sleep much, she replied without turning. Something on your mind? She shrugged. Not something new. Just, old noise. He didn't press. Instead, he stood, crossed to the counter, and began heating a pair of ration packs. He noticed she didn't go to her usual place by the heater this time. She stayed seated on the cot, watching the way his hands moved, her gaze slow and steady. They left earlier than usual for the day's inspection route. The corridors were quiet in the early hour, the air cooler before the full warmth of the day cycle seeped into the metal walls. Salai walked beside him without her hood, the silver marbling along her jawline, catching the pale station light. In the tighter passages, their arms brushed lightly, and neither of them shifted away. The contact was subtle, steady, and it traveled with them like a shared undercurrent. At the second checkpoint, Evan had to kneel to access a pressure valve, the heat from the pipe warming the air between them. Salai crouched beside him, knees nearly touching, her shoulder brushing his as she leaned in to watch his hands. "You're getting faster," she noted. He glanced at her, faint smile tugging at his mouth. "Or you're making me better at it." She didn't respond, but the corner of her mouth lifted, just enough for him to notice. Back in his quarters, the heater vent was cycling slow but steady. Salai went to her usual place by it, pulling the blanket over her legs, but she didn't tuck herself entirely into the corner as she used to. She left room beside her. Evan noticed, though he didn't comment, just took his cup of tea and sat there. The warmth between them was different from the mechanical breath of the vent. It was alive, almost visible in the way her arm rested close enough that their sleeves brushed when either of them shifted. They stayed there until the tea cooled and the light outside the narrow wall panel dimmed into the blue-gray of evening. The closeness grew in small ways after that. When they passed tools to each other during inspections, their hands would linger just long enough to feel the skin under glove edges. When they navigated tight corridors, they didn't step aside as far as they used to. One afternoon in the market strip, he caught her standing half a step closer than before, her shoulder brushing his jacket as they moved past a cluster of cargo handlers. No one made a comment. No one moved away. He saw her glance sideways just briefly, and something in her eyes had changed. Not relief exactly, but recognition. The real shift came on a night when the station's temperature dropped unexpectedly due to a central heating imbalance. The air inside the quarters had a faint bite to it, the kind of chill that seeps into your hands and stays. Evan was at the crate table trying to read through a diagnostic when Selai crossed the room, blanket in hand. Without a word, she draped it over his shoulders and settled beside him, pulling enough fabric over herself to share the heat. Her thigh pressed against his under the table. "You're cold," she murmured. "So are you," he replied, his voice quieter than usual. She didn't pull away. That night, instead of separating into cotton floor, she said simply, "You don't have to sleep down there." He looked at her for a long moment. "You sure?" She nodded once, the motion small but decisive. He joined her on the cot, lying fully clothed, leaving a narrow space between them. She shifted closer, resting her head lightly against his upper arm. "You can put your arm around me," she said after a pause. He did, slow and careful, letting his palm rest against her back, feeling the rise and fall of her breathing. The heater clicked in the corner. The rain whispered against the hull, and for the first time the space between them was not just gone. It had been replaced by something shared, something chosen. Neither of them moved for the rest of the night. The following days made that choice feel less like an exception and more like a quiet rule. She would rest a hand briefly on his forearm when they worked, steadying herself beside him on uneven flooring. He would brush her hair aside when it fell into her face as she leaned over a vent panel. There was no spoken agreement about any of it, but they both knew the space they had once guarded so fiercely had changed. A week later, during another cold snap in the sector, she shifted against him on the cot and tucked her face briefly into the side of his neck. Her breath was warm against his skin. "You're warmer than the heater," she murmured. He smiled faintly, tightening his arm around her. "So are you." That was the night she reached for his hand under the blanket. It wasn't hesitant. It wasn't asking for anything more than the contact itself. Their fingers intertwined, and for a long time, that was all there was. Two people lying in the quiet, closer than they had ever been, the steady hum of the station around them, and the shared heat between their bodies. By then, the heater was just background noise. Part 6. The First Time. She laughed. The day began with a low, metallic hum beneath the floor. The kind of sound you didn't notice unless you spent most of your time listening to the station breathe. Evan knew it meant the maintenance lifts in the lower decks were running a heavier load than usual. He filed it away in the back of his mind as he laced his boots. Salai was at the counter, hair braided loosely over one shoulder, sorting through the rations they'd picked up the day before. The way she moved now was different from when she'd first come here. There was no hesitation, no glance toward the door, as if deciding whether to bolt. "You're sorting them by flavor?" he asked, fastening his jacket. "They're not flavors," she said, keeping her eyes on the small stack in front of her. "They're tolerable, less tolerable, and emergency only." He gave a small huff of amusement. "Guess I've been eating emergency only for weeks." "You have," she said, glancing up briefly with the faintest hint of a smirk. Their inspection run took them toward the outer rim sectors, where the curved corridors let you feel the station's shape under your feet. Gravity felt a little lighter here, and the hum of the main engines was a soft throb through the walls. At the second checkpoint, a vent panel stuck halfway open when Evan tried to release it. He tugged twice, muttering under his breath, before Salai stepped beside him and pressed a small, hidden latch on the underside. The panel slid open smoothly. He looked at her. "You could have told me that before I started yanking on it." "I was curious how long you'd try before you noticed," she said, voice even. But there was something in her eyes. A spark, quick and almost playful. "That's cold," he said. "That's fair," she countered. It was the first time he'd heard her tease him. Later in the market strip, they stopped at a vendor selling heat gloves. Evan needed a new pair. The insulation in his old ones had worn thin. Salai picked up a pair from the rack, turning them over in her hands. "These would fit you," she said, passing them to him. He tried one on. "Not bad." She reached for another pair, slipped them on, then flexed her fingers. "I could use these," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Then get them." She hesitated. "They're new." He looked at her. "So?" She met his gaze for a moment, then turned back to the vendor and handed over the credits. When they stepped away, she flexed her gloved hands again, and for the first time since he'd met her, he saw the smallest upward curl at the corner of her mouth that wasn't a smirk or a guarded expression. It was almost a smile. The moment it happened was back in his quarters that evening. They were sitting side by side on the cot, splitting a tolerable ration pack, when the heater sputtered once and let out a sound that could only be described as a high-pitched, wheezing cough. Evan frowned. "That's new." Salai tilted her head, listening. "It sounds like it's choking on dust. It's not supposed to sound like that. Maybe it's protesting all the attention you give me instead of it." He turned to her in mock offense. "Are you jealous on behalf of the heater?" And that was when it happened. She laughed. Not a polite exhale, not a short huff, but a quick, real laugh that slipped out before she could stop it. It was quiet, unpolished, the sound of someone surprised by their own amusement. Evan froze, caught off guard. Then he smiled, slow and genuine. "You should do that more." Her cheeks warmed faintly, though she didn't look away. "It's been a while." The rest of the night felt lighter. They still shared the blanket, still sat close, but there was something else in the air now. The knowledge that she could laugh here, that the weight between them didn't have to be all silence and guarded breaths. When they finally lay down, her hand found his under the blanket without looking. And in that quiet, Evan realized the space they'd closed between them wasn't just about warmth anymore. It was about the fact that she'd let him hear the part of her that had been buried the longest. The next day's inspection work took them into Sector F2, a place where the station always seemed to be holding its breath. The corridors here were tight, the lighting strips buzzing with intermittent flickers, and the air had a faint, almost sweet tang of coolant vapor from a leak somewhere in the distance. Evan had always found the sector tedious to navigate, but with Salai beside him it felt different. Less like slogging through a checklist, more like walking with someone who noticed things worth noticing. They stopped at a moisture valve junction. Evan scanned the readings, frowning at the high percentage. "This shouldn't be this wet," he muttered. Salai crouched beside him, tracing her gloved fingers along the pipe seam until she found the tiniest bead of water clinging to the metal. "Hairline crack," she said. "If you rotate the joint half a degree, it'll stop until we can replace it." He glanced at her, impressed. "You make me look bad." "That's not hard," she replied, tone flat but with just enough inflection for him to catch it. He shook his head, smiling to himself as he adjusted the joint. As they made their way back toward the main corridor, they passed a group of cargo techs wrestling with a stubborn grav crate. The crate was jammed against the corner of the bulkhead, and one of the techs, a wiry man with grease-stained sleeves, was swearing under his breath. Evan stopped. "You need a hand." The man looked up. "If you've got one to spare." Selai stepped forward before Evan could. She sized up the angle, then gestured for the tech to move aside. Together, she and Evan lifted the crate just enough for the grav cushion to re-engage. It floated free with a low hum. The tech gave a short nod of thanks and they moved on. "You didn't have to do that," Evan said once they were clear. "I know," she said. "Felt like doing it." Her voice was casual, but there was something in the way she kept her shoulders squared as they walked. A quiet pride that she hadn't tried to hide. That evening, back in the quarters, They were cleaning their gloves when the heater gave another sputter, this one followed by a low, grumbling whine. Evan tapped the casing with the heel of his hand. "You're going to make me tear you apart one of these days," he muttered. "Maybe it likes the attention," Sci-Fi said, mirroring the comment she'd made the night before. He glanced at her. "Are you going to keep siding with the heater?" "I'm just saying," she replied. "You don't give me maintenance checks every week." The words hung there for a moment, and then she broke. A short burst of laughter, not loud, but genuine enough to pull his own smile wider. "That's twice in 2 days," he said. "You're spoiling me." She shook her head, still smiling faintly. "Don't get used to it." The following morning, they were scheduled for an early shift in the intake filtration ring, a messy job that meant pulling thick, dust-heavy filters from the massive air processors. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was necessary, and Evan knew it would be easier with 4 hands instead of 2. They worked in near silence at first, the only sounds the scrape of filters being removed and the thud as replacements slid into place. When one of the old filters collapsed under its own weight, spilling a cascade of fine gray dust across the floor, Evan sighed. "That's going to take forever to clean," he said. Sci-Fi crouched, scooping dust into the disposal bin. "Unless we pretend it was already like that." He raised an eyebrow. "You suggesting we falsify a report?" "I'm suggesting," she said, a spark in her tone, "that if the stations ignored this long enough for the filter to rot, they can wait another day to have the floor clean." He tried to look scandalized, but failed. She caught his expression, and the corner of her mouth twitched upward again. Back in the quarters, they dumped their gloves in the small wash bin and set water to boil for tea. Sci-Fi stood at the counter, leaning one hip against it while Evan sat at the table. "You've been—" He hesitated, searching for the right word. "What?" she prompted. "Lighter," he said finally. "Since yesterday." She poured the hot water into 2 cups. "Maybe I forgot how heavy I'd gotten," she said. "And maybe it's not as heavy here." He accepted the tea from her hand, fingers brushing hers. "Then I'll do what I can to keep it that way." She didn't answer, but when she sat beside him, her knee pressed lightly against his and stayed there. That night, instead of her usual place against his side on the cot, she shifted until her legs were tangled with his under the blanket. Her head rested on his shoulder, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. "It's strange," she said. "What is?" "How quickly I stopped counting the days," she replied. "Before, every day was just, how long until I could leave, or until I was told to leave. And now? Now it's just here. And you." Evan turned his head slightly toward her. "I can live with that." She gave a small, warm huff. Not quite laughter, but close enough to feel like a promise. When he drifted to sleep later, her hand was still resting over his, her fingers loosely curled as if she'd forgotten to let go. It wasn't just the first time she laughed. It was the first time she seemed to believe there might be more worth laughing for. And Evan knew he would protect that, fiercely, quietly, and for as long as she let him. Part 7. What she asked for at midnight. The station was sleeping. At least that's how it felt when Evan lay awake, staring at the faint lines of shadow on the ceiling of his quarters. The usual thrum of machinery was muted, like the whole place had drawn a slow, quiet breath and was holding it. Sci-Fi was curled against his side under the blanket, her breathing deep and steady. Or at least it had been steady until a moment ago, when he felt the shift. A subtle change in her rhythm, the kind that told him she wasn't sleeping either. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, when she spoke. "Evan." He turned his head toward her. "Yeah?" She didn't answer right away. Her fingers moved slightly against his chest, as though tracing the shape of the words she hadn't said yet. Finally, she whispered, "Would you hold me closer?" He adjusted without thinking, his arms sliding more fully around her, pulling her into the curve of his body. She fit there easily, her head beneath his chin, the strands of her hair brushing lightly against his jaw. "That better?" he murmured. "Yes," she said, but her tone carried something else, something quieter, deeper. For a long while they lay like that, the warmth between them blending until he couldn't tell where his ended and hers began. Then she shifted slightly, enough that her face was tilted up toward his. The low light caught the silver marbling along her temple, the faint gleam of her eyes as they met his. Her next words came slowly, as if she was still testing how they would sound aloud. "I want to feel More than just safe tonight. He held her gaze, searching for any trace of doubt. There was none. Only the steady, unflinching openness of someone who had decided this for herself. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. She nodded, the movement small but certain. "With you, yes." The space between them disappeared in the simplest way, not rushed, not deliberate, but in the natural gravity of two people who had already been moving toward each other for weeks. Her lips were warm against his, the touch so light at first it felt like a question. He answered without words, his hand lifting to the side of her face, feeling the faint, quick pulse beneath her skin. There was nothing hurried about the way they kissed. It was unspoken language, each breath carrying more trust than the last. The room felt smaller, the hum of the station fading until there was only the soft sound of their breathing, the shift of fabric as they drew closer. She rested her forehead against his for a moment, eyes closed. "I didn't think I'd ever want this again," she whispered. "You don't have to want anything you don't choose," he murmured back. "I'm choosing," she said, and the way she looked at him left no doubt. They lay together in the quiet, the contact slow and deliberate, his hand along her back, her fingers tracing idle, weightless patterns against his chest. Every movement was gentle, every pause an unspoken check that they were still moving together. It wasn't urgency that filled the space between them. It was the deep, quiet relief of finally allowing themselves to be seen without guard. By the time her breathing evened again, she was resting fully against him, their legs tangled under the blanket, her hands still caught loosely in his. The heater hummed low in the corner, but neither of them noticed. Tonight, warmth had nothing to do with it. They stayed in that silence for a long time, neither rushing the moment nor shying away from it. Evan could feel the slow rise and fall of her breathing against him, the steady thump of her pulse where her wrist rested near his collarbone. The small shifts of her body as she settled into the curve of his frame were unhurried, like she was relearning what it meant to be comfortable in someone else's arms. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a murmur. "It's strange," she said. "What is?" "That I feel more myself here, in this bed, on this station, than I have in years." He smoothed a hand along her back, not to coax more from her, but to let her know he was listening. "It's not because of the place," she continued softly. "It's because of you." The words sat between them, warm and heavy. He didn't try to answer right away, didn't try to find some perfect line. Instead, he pressed his forehead lightly to hers, closing his eyes. "Then I'll keep being that place, for as long as you want it." Her hand slid from his chest to the side of his neck, fingers curling lightly as if she was committing the shape of him to memory. The contact wasn't urgent, wasn't asking for more, but it was intimate in a way that left no room for pretense. When her lips found his again, they lingered a little longer this time. The kiss deepened by slow degrees, each movement deliberate, each breath shared. The weight of her pressed closer, and he shifted to accommodate her, his arm firm at her back. Her skin was warm where his fingertips brushed the space just below her shoulder blade, and the faint, almost imperceptible sound she made in response was enough to send a current through him. He pulled back just far enough to search her expression, to make sure he wasn't imagining the openness there. "I'm still choosing," she whispered, answering the question he hadn't asked aloud. They moved together with the same patience they'd been learning from each other since the day they met. Every shift of position was wordless but understood, her hands sliding along his ribs, his fingers finding hers and holding them loosely before letting her guide them. The warmth grew between them, not in a sudden flare, but in the slow, steady way coals build heat until it seeps into everything. Clothing wasn't cast aside in haste. A sleeve pushed up, a zipper eased down, enough to let skin meet skin where it hadn't before. The sensation was new but not jarring, the kind of closeness that felt inevitable rather than stolen. Her breathing hitched once, a quiet sound in the dark, and he stilled immediately. "Tell me if you want to stop." Her hand came up to cup his face, her thumb brushing along his jaw. "I don't," she said simply, her voice steady. When their bodies aligned fully, it was with the kind of ease that only comes when trust is absolute. They held on to each other like the world beyond the thin metal walls could wait. The rhythm they found wasn't frantic but unhurried, the kind that let them feel every shift, every shared breath. She moved with him as though she'd known him longer than she had, not in history, but in the language of touch and trust. Her forehead rested against his shoulder at one moment, then against his temple the next, her lips brushing his skin in small, almost absent-minded kisses. He memorized the way her breath warmed the side of his neck, the faint tremor in her hand where it clutched his arm, the sound she made when his thumb traced slow circles over her hip. When the last of the movement faded, they stayed entwined, the blanket drawn around them, their breathing slowly sinking again. Evan brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek and was met with her eyes, silver catching the dim light. "You're quiet," he said softly. "I'm full," she replied after a moment, as if the word was the only one that fit. "Full?" She nodded, her palm resting flat against his chest. "Like the space I'd been holding for fear is finally filled with something better." He kissed her temple. "Then I hope it stays that way." They drifted into conversation in the low, hushed way people do when they're too close to be casual anymore. She told him a fragment of a memory from her childhood. Not a sad one, but a quiet, bright piece about her mother teaching her how to braid her own hair. He told her about the first time he saw the station from the outside, how it looked like a silver coin hanging in the dark. Every so often, their words would pause, and one of them would lean in, their lips finding each other without thinking about it. It wasn't about starting something again. It was about keeping the connection warm, alive, uninterrupted. At some point, the heater let out another of its small mechanical sighs, and she shifted closer into his chest. "I think I like it," she said sleepily. "The heater?" "Mm-hmm," she murmured. "It sounds like it's keeping watch." "Then let it watch," he said, pulling the blanket higher over them both. The following morning was different in ways that had nothing to do with what they'd done, and everything to do with how they moved together now. They still went about their routine, checking vents, replacing filters, passing through the narrow, echoing corridors of the station. But there was a subtle, unspoken thread between every glance and touch. When she handed him a tool, her fingers lingered against his. When he passed her in the narrow passage, his palm brushed her lower back in a way that was protective without being possessive. And when they returned to their quarters that evening, she sat close enough that their shoulders touched the entire time they ate. It wasn't that the distance between them had closed overnight. It was that it no longer existed at all. That night, when the station quieted again, she was already in his arms before he even lay down. "You're warm," she said simply, as if it were the only thing worth noting. "So are you," he replied. Her hand rested over his heart, her thumb moving in small, absent strokes. "Then I guess we'll keep each other that way." And they did. Part 8. When the outer deck went dark. It started with a flicker. Not the small, lazy kind the corridor lights sometimes gave off when a transformer was running hot, but a sharp, fast pulse. A blink, then nothing. Evan was at the small counter in their quarters, stacking the day's maintenance reports. Salai was on the cot, her legs drawn up under her, idly twisting a length of wire into a loop. The hum of the heater was steady, the air warm enough that neither of them had thought about pulling on another layer. Then the floor vibrated. A short, almost imperceptible tremor. Salai's head came up instantly. "That wasn't the heater." "No," Evan agreed. He set the reports aside and crossed to the wall console. The status display was still lit, for now, but several panels were flashing amber. Sector E9, outer deck. Power loss. The station had its moods. Sometimes it grumbled like an old animal, tolerating the people moving through its bones. But a full deck going dark, that wasn't a mood. That was a problem. Evan grabbed his tool harness from the wall. "We need to get out there before it's a full systems cascade." "I'm coming with you," Salai said, already reaching for her own gloves. "Salai?" She shot him a look that left no room for debate. "If it's outer deck systems, I can handle the diagnostics faster than you. You know that." He did. And though every protective instinct in him wanted to keep her here, in the warm circle of their quarters, he also knew there wasn't time to argue. The corridors leading to the outer deck felt colder, the air sharp against their faces. Emergency strips along the floor cast a pale, narrow light, and the usual steady hum of the station's power core was muted to a low, unsettling throb. When they reached the main hatch to Sector E9, The panel refused to open on the first try. Salai crouched beside it, her fingers quick over the manual override. "Circuit's dead. I can bypass it if—" The panel hissed open before she finished, revealing a stretch of corridor shrouded in shadow. The light from the hatch only reached a few meters inside before the darkness swallowed it whole. Evan clipped a lamp to his harness. "Stay close." She stepped up beside him, her own light cutting a narrow path through the dark. The deeper they went, the more obvious it became that this wasn't just a blown transformer. The air smelled faintly of burnt insulation, and the walls bore streaks of something that looked too deliberate to be accident damage. Salai slowed, her gaze scanning the marks. "These aren't from a surge," she murmured. "They're patterned." "Patterned how?" "Like someone wanted them to be found." The words settled heavy in his chest. They weren't alone out here. At the end of the corridor, the control hub for the deck's environmental systems was dark. Evan knelt at the main access port, pulling a diagnostic cable from his harness. Salai crouched beside him, her light fixed on the panel. "Power relay's been severed," he said after a moment. "Not burned out, cut." Her jaw tightened. So this wasn't a failure, it was sabotage. Which means whoever did it might still be here. A sound from deeper in the dark. Soft, but distinct. Not the creak of cooling metal. Footsteps. Evan rose slowly, scanning the narrow space ahead. Salai shifted subtly to his side, her lamp aimed forward. Neither of them spoke. Another step. Closer. He reached into his harness for the small plasma cutter. Not a weapon, but sharp enough to make someone think twice. "Who's there?" His voice carried low but firm through the corridor. The steps stopped. Silence pressed in around them. It lasted only a few seconds, but in that time he felt Salai's fingers brush his arm. Not in fear, but in silent readiness. They'd moved together in maintenance corridors before, but this was different. Every sense was sharpened, every motion measured. When the noise came again, it was moving away, retreating deeper into the deck. Evan and Salai exchanged a glance. "We can't chase them blind," he said. "No," she agreed, "but we can lock this sector down so they can't come back." They worked quickly, bypassing the main control hub and rerouting emergency power just enough to trigger the bulkhead seals. The lights along the corridor flickered to life, weak but enough to banish the worst of the shadows. With the seals in place, they retraced their steps, their breaths clouding faintly in the cooler air. Back at the hatch, Evan keyed the manual close. The door shut with a heavy hiss. "That should keep them out," he said. "For now," Salai replied. When they finally returned to their quarters, the heater's hum felt louder, steadier, a sound that carried more comfort than it should have. Salai pulled off her gloves and sat on the edge of the cot. "You saw the marks," she said quietly. "Yeah. Someone wanted to scare us." He shook his head. "Then they picked the wrong two people." Her gaze softened at that, and she leaned back on her hands. "You weren't going to leave me behind, were you?" "Not a chance," he said. And when he sat beside her, she leaned in, their shoulders touching, the unspoken truth between them as steady as the heater's hum. They didn't speak for a while after returning, letting the tension bleed out of the air in the small ways they knew how. The hiss of the kettle on the hot plate, the soft rustle of fabric as Salai shed her outer jacket and folded it neatly by the door. The warmth from the heater wrapped around them again, though it felt thinner now, like the shadows from the outer deck had followed them here. Evan poured the water into 2 mugs, sliding one across the counter toward her. She accepted it without meeting his eyes, staring instead into the steam curling from the surface. "You think it's connected to the supply losses last month," she said at last. He leaned back against the counter, arms crossed. "It fits. Whoever's behind it knows exactly where to cut, exactly how to keep it looking like equipment failure. At least until someone takes a closer look." Her fingers tightened slightly on the mug. "So they're not just careless scavengers. They're careful. Too careful for me to believe this is random." She set the mug down, the ceramic clicking softly against the counter. "If they're willing to cut environmental systems on a deck, they're willing to do worse." He didn't disagree, but he didn't say it aloud either. The truth was, the saboteur could have been on that deck with them tonight, watching from the shadows, waiting. He'd seen enough in the marks on the walls and the precision of the relay cut to know this wasn't someone's first time. Salai stepped closer, her eyes meeting his. You're thinking of going back out there tomorrow. Not alone, he said, and that earned him a flicker of a smile. The smile faded as quickly as it had come, replaced by a thoughtful stillness. Evan, if someone wanted to force us off this station, cutting power to the outer deck is a start, but you and I both know there are more critical systems they could hit. He nodded slowly, which means either they're testing us or they're sending a message. Her voice was low when she asked, "What kind of message?" "One that says they know where to find us." The air between them shifted, not colder exactly, but taut, like a drawn wire. Evan could feel the old habits in himself wanting to close off, to plan in silence. But this wasn't just his fight anymore. So instead he said, "If they come back, we're ready, together." She studied him for a beat before her shoulders eased. "Together," she agreed. They slept lightly that night. Or maybe it just felt that way because every creak in the walls and every sigh from the heater kept them half aware. At one point, near what must have been the station's equivalent of 3 in the morning, Evan woke to find Salai sitting upright beside him, her head tilted as if listening. "You hear it too?" he whispered. She nodded. A faint metallic tap, irregular, spaced apart, but too deliberate to be from the station's settling frame. Evan reached for the small lamp on the wall, keeping the light low. "Stay here." "I'm not—" "Salai," he said quietly but firmly. "If it's nothing, I'll be back in 30 seconds. If it's something, I need you to be here when I get back." Her jaw tightened, but she nodded once. He slipped into the corridor barefoot, the cool floor biting against his skin. The tapping was coming from 2 hatches down, near the auxiliary maintenance shaft. When he reached it, he saw nothing. Just the closed hatch, its access light steady green. He pressed his palm to the metal. Warm. Too warm for a shaft that wasn't in active use tonight. Someone had been here recently. He checked the panel. No damage, no overrides logged. The warmth was fading by the time he stepped back, as if whatever had been heating the metal was now gone. Back in their quarters, Salai was still sitting upright, her eyes tracking him as soon as he stepped through the door. "Well, nothing I can prove," he admitted, sitting on the edge of the cot. "But someone was there. Could have been moving through the shaft, could have been watching." She leaned forward, her elbows on her knees. "We can't keep waiting for them to make the next move." "No," he said. "We make it first." By morning, they had a plan. Not a reckless one. Neither of them believed in walking into trouble without a way back out, but one that would let them bait whoever was moving through the station's blind spots. It meant staying close to the outer deck. It meant setting up remote sensors Evan had scavenged from the old comms array. And it meant long hours of waiting, side by side, in the cold, dim-lit maintenance alcoves where the hum of the station's life support was the only constant sound. It was during one of those waits, hours into the stillness, that Salai leaned her head against his shoulder and murmured, "It's strange." "What is?" he asked. "That I'm not afraid. Even here, even knowing someone's out there." He turned slightly to look at her. "You think that's a good thing?" "I think it's because of you," she said simply, and the way she said it left no space for doubt. The trap wasn't perfect. No plan ever was. But when the sensor alert finally blinked on Evan's handheld, they were ready. The movement registered 2 sections over, near a power relay junction. Evan and Salai moved quickly but quietly, their breath frosting in the air as they closed the distance. When they rounded the last corner, the figure was already there, crouched over the open relay box, a small cutting tool in hand. "Stop!" Evan's voice echoed off the metal walls. The figure bolted. They gave chase through the narrow corridors, the clang of boots on metal ringing in Evan's ears. Salai was fast, keeping pace beside him, her eyes fixed on their quarry. The figure darted into a storage alcove, and they cornered them there, breathless, caught between the bulkhead and the 2 of them. It was a human. Evan hadn't been sure until now, but the pale, wide-eyed face looking back at them was unmistakable. "You don't understand," the stranger said quickly, hands raised. "I wasn't trying to hurt you." Salai stepped forward, her voice steady. "Then tell us what you were trying to do." The story came out in fragments. A stolen contract, a debt owed to someone who could collect in blood, a job taken under threat. The saboteur had been told to cripple the station's outer systems, to make it vulnerable for a boarding. "Boarding by who?" Evan demanded. The man hesitated, then shook his head. You don't want to know. Evan took a step closer, his voice low. I think we do. They didn't get the answer that night. The man bolted again when a distant clang in the pipes drew everyone's attention, vanishing into the maze of corridors before they could catch him. But they had his face now, and his fear. Back in their quarters, Salai leaned against the door after locking it, her breath finally slowing. This isn't over. No, Evan agreed, but we're not running. Her eyes met his, and in that look was the same quiet certainty she'd had the night she asked him to hold her closer, the same understanding that whatever came next, they'd meet it together. Part 9. The Message in the Walls. The station was quieter than it had any right to be. After the chase, after the adrenaline had burned itself into a dull ache in Evan's legs, he noticed it. Even the heater's low hum seemed reluctant, as if the machinery itself knew something was creeping in through the seams. Salai hadn't sat down since they'd returned. She moved around their quarters in short, precise motions, hanging her gloves, setting tools in their places, but her mind was elsewhere. You're thinking about the marks again, Evan said finally, her hands stilled over the counter. Because they weren't random, and because I think I've seen them before. He looked up sharply. Where? She hesitated as if deciding whether to give voice to the thought. Not here. Back on Trithar 5. The mining colonies used marks like that, patterns cut into bulkhead panels, to guide people through sections when the power was out. But these, she turned toward him, these weren't guiding anyone out. They were guiding them in. To what? That's what scares me, she said quietly. They didn't sleep. Instead, they pulled up the station's archived construction diagrams on the wall console, cross-referencing the marked spots Salai remembered from their walk through the outer deck. The paths didn't align with any maintenance routes or power lines. They were cutting through structural dead zones, places no one had a reason to go unless they were looking for something buried there. When the lines were all mapped, they formed a shape neither of them recognized at first, a jagged spiral curling inward toward a single point. What's there? Evan asked, tapping the center. Salai's gaze was steady. An old cargo vault, sealed before I ever set foot on this station. By morning, they were standing in front of the vault's hatch. It was heavier than the others, the kind designed to withstand vacuum breach. Dust lined the seams, the air here colder and thinner. Evan crouched at the panel. It's not on the main system anymore. Someone pulled the access registry decades ago. So whoever's been marking the walls, they're leading someone here without tripping the station's logs. He glanced up at her. Or they're leading us. It took nearly an hour to crack the hatch without triggering the manual lockdown. When it finally slid open, stale air rushed out, carrying the faint metallic tang of long unmoved machinery. Inside, the vault was darker than the corridors had been. Not the absence of light dark, but the kind that felt heavy, as if it had weight pressing on the edges of their vision. Their lamps cut narrow beams through the space, revealing stacked crates sealed with alien glyphs. Salai stepped forward, brushing her fingers over one. This writing, it's Calith. You can read it. Enough to know it says, property of the 7th Wing. Evan frowned. That mean anything to you? It shouldn't be here, she said almost to herself. The 7th Wing doesn't leave their holdings unguarded. Ever. He was about to ask more when his lamp caught on something at the far wall. Not a crate, but a series of panels pulled loose, the marks carved deep into the metal beneath. Salai crossed to it, kneeling to trace the spiral pattern. This is the same as the corridor marks. Whoever's doing this, they're claiming the space. For what? Her answer was a whisper. A staging ground. A faint sound behind them made them both turn. The same irregular tapping from the night before. It was closer now, somewhere just beyond the open hatch. Evan motioned for Salai to kill her lamp. Darkness folded in, their breathing loud in the sudden stillness. The tapping grew softer, then stopped entirely. When they relit their lamps, the hatch was closed. Evan was on it in 3 long steps, but the panel was dead, sealed from the outside. Whoever had shut them in had done it without a sound. Salai's voice was steady in the dark. So, they know we're here. The first thing Evan did was test the panel again, but it was completely cold. Not just unpowered, but cut from any feed. meaning whoever had sealed them in didn't want the hatch open from this side. His mind began cataloging possibilities, not just for escape, but for why anyone would want them trapped here. Salai's lamp beam flicked toward the far end of the vault. There might be another way out. Cargo vaults like this sometimes had emergency lifts for sealed deliveries. He followed her through the narrow aisles between crates, each one sealed with the same alien script. She moved like she was walking a thin thread, each step light but quick. The deeper they went, the more Evan noticed a change in the air. A faint current that brushed past his skin, too subtle to be from their movement alone. There, she said, pointing to a half-concealed panel near the floor. He crouched and ran his fingers along the seam. It wasn't locked, only wedged shut by something heavy behind it. They worked together, shifting two small crates aside until the panel gave way. Beyond it, a shaft stretched upward, lit faintly by emergency strips. Salai peered up into it. Climbable, if you trust the rungs to hold. He tested one. It groaned but didn't give. You first, he said. She arched an eyebrow. So if it snaps, I break the fall? You're lighter, he countered, which earned him the faintest twitch of a smile before she began climbing. Halfway up, the light in the shaft dimmed, and a faint vibration ran through the metal beneath their hands. It wasn't the hum of machinery. It was the steady thump of footsteps, slow and deliberate, somewhere above. Salai froze, her head tilted toward the sound. Evan's heart kicked hard in his chest. Whoever was up there had to know they were climbing toward them. Then the sound stopped. They waited in the stillness, every muscle tight. When Salai started moving again, she was faster, her hands and feet finding each rung with precision. Evan followed, his own breath loud in the confined space. When they reached the hatch at the top, it was already open. They emerged into a section of the station Evan didn't recognize. Narrower corridors, older plating, the lights flickering in irregular bursts. It smelled faintly of ozone and something sharper, like burned insulation. This isn't on any of the schematics we saw, he said. Salai glanced back at him. That's because this isn't supposed to exist. They moved carefully, listening for any sign of the person they'd heard. At one junction, Salai knelt by the wall and brushed her fingers over a fresh mark. The same spiral pattern, cut deep enough that flakes of metal curled at the edges. They're still here, she murmured. They followed the marks, the path winding through increasingly narrow passages until it opened into a chamber that looked nothing like the rest of the station. The walls here were plated in a dull, matte alloy, and in the center sat a console older than anything Evan had seen outside a museum. Circular, with a raised core covered in more Caliph glyphs. Salai approached it slowly, as though afraid her footsteps might wake it. This is a relay hub, she said, almost in disbelief. Not for this station, for a network that hasn't existed for over a century. What's it doing here? That's the question someone's been cutting these marks to answer. Before they could examine it further, a voice came from the shadows beyond the console. You're not supposed to be here. Evan turned sharply, his hand going to the small tool knife on his belt. The man who stepped into the light wasn't the saboteur they chased. This one was taller, older, his face marked with a thin scar that ran from temple to jaw. Salai's tone was flat. You sealed us in the vault. He didn't deny it. For your own good. You start pulling at the wrong threads here, you'll find more than you can tie back up. Evan stepped forward. We already found them, and we're not leaving until we know what this is. The man's gaze flicked between them, assessing. Then you're already too deep. What followed wasn't a fight. Not exactly. The man didn't move toward them, didn't raise a weapon, but his presence filled the room like a physical weight. He told them, in measured words, that the spiral marks were a claim. A Caliph territorial code, old enough that few still recognized it, used to mark hidden assets. The vault they'd entered wasn't for storage, but for staging supplies for something coming back through the station. When Evan pressed for who or what, the man only said, when you hear the first signal in the walls, you'll know. Then he stepped back into the shadows, and by the time they moved to follow, the corridor beyond was empty. Back in their quarters, Salai paced in tight lines while Evan sat on the cot, turning the words over in his mind. You believe him? Evan asked. I believe enough to know we're not dealing with scavengers, she said. This is deliberate. Old code, old tech, old grudges. He watched her stop at the window, her hand resting against the cold glass as she looked out at the slow arc of debris drifting past the station. "You've seen this before, haven't you?" he asked quietly. Her voice was almost a whisper. "I've seen what happens when the marks are finished." She didn't explain that night, and he didn't push, but the air between them had changed again. Not distance exactly, but the kind of awareness that comes when you realize the fight ahead is bigger than you thought. Later, as they lay in the dim light, her hand found his beneath the blanket. No words passed between them, but the grip was firm, steady, the kind that said neither of them would be facing this alone. And somewhere deep in the walls, so faint they might have missed it if they hadn't been listening, came the first hollow echo of tapping. Part 10. When the walls spoke back. It began as a slow, irregular tap in the walls, just enough to make Evan wonder if it was the same sound they'd heard on the outer deck. But then it spread. One knock became 3, then 6 in quick succession, the pattern echoing down the corridors. Sci-Fi sat up on the cot, her eyes wide but focused. "That's it," she said quietly. "The signal?" She nodded once. "They're here." The heater's hum seemed suddenly louder, like it was trying to mask the sound. But the tapping wasn't just noise now. It was a code. One Sci-Fi moved to the wall to follow, her palm pressed to the cold plating. "It's the spiral pattern," she murmured, mapped in sound. Evan stood beside her, "Which means they've finished marking the route." She turned, meeting his eyes with a seriousness he'd only seen once before, the day she told him about leaving her homeworld. "If they're coming through the vault, we have one chance to stop them. Once they're in, they won't stop until they own this station." They moved fast, tool harnesses on, jackets zipped against the cooler air of the maintenance decks. The corridors were dimmer than usual, the emergency strips flickering in and out like a warning heartbeat. As they neared the vault, the tapping grew louder. Not mechanical, but like something striking the walls from the inside. Evan's chest tightened. "They're not just outside the hatch." "No," Sci-Fi said. "They're already in the walls." Inside the vault, the crates were no longer stacked in neat rows. Several had been dragged aside, revealing a section of the far wall that was open now, its panels peeled back like the shell of some great insect. Beyond it was a blackness so complete it seemed to swallow their lamps. Sci-Fi stepped forward slowly. "That's not a maintenance crawl space." "What is it?" "A passage," she said, "but it's not supposed to exist in this reality." The tapping came again, this time from within the black, and underneath it, faint but distinct, a voice speaking in Caliph. Sci-Fi's head tilted, listening. "What's it saying?" Evan asked. She swallowed. "It's asking for permission to enter." The choice hung there, not in the air, but between them. If they shut the vault now, they could seal whatever was on the other side away. But they didn't know what it was, or if it could be stopped once it found another way in. Evan stepped closer to her. "If we let it through, we might be opening the station to something we can't fight," she finished. They stood in the dim light, the cold brushing past their faces from the open wall. And then Sci-Fi reached down, took his hand and said, "We close it." The work was brutal. Without the main controls active, they had to force the vault's emergency plates back into place manually, each one locked with a deep, resonant thud, the sound echoing down the corridor outside. When they reached the final plate, the tapping surged, the rhythm frantic now, like fists pounding from the other side. Evan's shoulders burned as he held the panel steady, Sci-Fi driving the locking pin into place. The moment it sealed, the tapping stopped. They stayed there a long time, listening. The silence was heavier than the noise had been. Sci-Fi finally stepped back, wiping a streak of grease from her cheek with the back of her glove. "It's not gone," she said. "It's waiting." "Then we'll be ready," Evan said. Her gaze softened just enough to let him know she believed him. Back in their quarters, the heater's hum was steady again. Sci-Fi sat on the cot, her posture easier now but still carrying the weight of what they'd done. "You know," Evan said, settling beside her, "we could leave. Take one of the station's skiffs. Get as far from this as we can." She shook her head. "This is our home now, and I don't run from things that carve spirals in my walls." There was no heat in the words, just certainty. He smiled faintly. "Guess I'm staying then." They turned in without another word, the light in the room dimming to a soft amber glow. Outside, the station drifted in its long orbit, the scars on the outer deck still visible, but sealed for now against whatever had been trying to come through. Somewhere deep inside the walls, far from where anyone would hear, the spiral waited. And in the small warmth of their quarters, Sci leaned into him, her head against his shoulder, her eyes closing not because she felt safe, but because she decided to trust the one person who'd never once tried to send her away. The station settled into its long drift again. To an outsider, a ship passing at a safe distance, a trader skimming the outer beacons, nothing about it looked different. The metal hull still bore the scuffs of decades in service. The slow rotation still kept its artificial gravity steady. But if you were inside, you knew. The spiral was there. Not moving, not marking new walls, but present in a way that was less about sight and more about knowing. It was a shadow in the station's blueprint, a part of the architecture that didn't appear on any schematic, yet had always been there. Evans still walked the outer decks at night, listening. Sci still moved like someone mapping a route only she could see. They didn't speak often about the vault or the voice that had asked to come through, but every so often when the heater's hum dipped too low, they'd look at each other and know they were both thinking the same thing. That the silence wasn't victory, it was an agreement. Life threaded itself back into their days. Evan fixed the power relay that had been sputtering since the storm. Sci traded for new filter mesh from a passing freighter, haggling with the kind of sharp patience that left the captain blinking at how much he'd given up. They made small repairs to the damage from the chase, replacing floor panels and sealing hairline fractures in the glass of the observation ring. It would have been easy to pretend this was all there was now. Maintenance, trade, the quiet rhythm of surviving together. Some nights they did. On those nights, Evan would find himself leaning against the heater while Sci sat cross-legged on the floor, mending a torn sleeve. They'd talk about things that didn't matter, like whether the station's coffee ever tasted different when the orbit shifted, or what color the sun looked on her homeworld when the air was clear. It was in those moments that the weight of the spiral felt far away. One night, weeks after they'd sealed the vault, Sci set down her tools and looked at him for a long time before speaking. "You've stayed through everything." "Wasn't really a choice," he said lightly. "Yes, it was," she said, and there was no humor in her voice. He met her gaze. "Then I guess I chose you." For a moment, the station felt smaller, not in a way that trapped them, but in a way that made it theirs. The heater's warmth wrapped around them, the slow rhythm of the station's rotation pressing gently against the edges of their world. The next day, Evan found fresh supplies stacked neatly outside their quarters. Not from any trader they knew. The crates bore no marks, no spiral, just the plain metal faces of goods meant to keep them alive for months. Sci saw him staring at them and said, "Sometimes when the spiral decides you belong in its space, it stops trying to push you out." "You think that's what this is?" She didn't answer directly, just lifted the smallest crate and carried it inside. "Whatever it is, we'll use it." They never told the station's central registry about the vault, or the man in the shadows, or the voice in the dark. That was theirs to hold, just as much as the heater's hum or the faint scratch in the window frame where Sci had set her tools down one night and forgotten them. And in the long silence that followed the last tap in the walls, they found something that wasn't exactly peace, but it was enough. Enough to share coffee in the morning without checking every corner first. Enough to leave the heater on low at night without worrying about power drain. Enough to believe that, for now, the spiral could sleep. The last time Evan walked the outer deck before the next supply run, he paused by the panel where he'd first seen the marks. The metal was smooth again, no sign of the spiral cut into it. But as he stood there, the faintest vibration ran through the floor under his boots. Not a tap, not yet, just a reminder. He smiled without meaning to. "We'll be here when you wake up," he said quietly. Back inside, Sci was waiting. She didn't ask what he'd been looking at. She didn't need to. And as the station turned in the cold between the stars, the two of them stayed where they had chosen to be. Together, in the place they'd made their own. Listening not for danger, but for the promise that when the walls spoke back again, they'd answer.